Okay. And then I'm going to turn on the YouTube so folks can join us there in case they're accessing from there. Okay, so just a moment for that. Okay. All right, so I think that's good. We are all set. We're on YouTube and we are here at our Zoom. So we're going to start. All right. All right, I want to welcome everyone to our Day of Remembrance event. I'm Perlita Payne and I'm a librarian at Berkeley Public Library. I'm so honored to have you all here and to be joined by many colleagues in public libraries around the state. Today's Day of Remembrance commemorates 79 years since the signing of Executive Order 9066, which removed and incarcerated 120,000 Japanese Americans on the West Coast. Many of you may have already digitally viewed the documentary And Then They Came for Us. Tonight, we are joined by George Takei, Satsuki Aina, and Abby Ginsberg from the film. I will now introduce our panelists here. So we're going to start with Kristen Sasaki, who is our moderator for this conversation. She's an assistant professor in the Ethnic Studies Department at UCSD. Previously, she was a faculty member at San Francisco State's Asian American Studies Department. Her published works have appeared in the American Quarterly and Pacific Historical Review. Her current book project, Pacific Confluence, Negotiating the Nation in 19th Century Hawaii, is contracted with UC Press. Abby Ginsberg is a Peabody Award-winning director with over 30 years producing compelling documentaries about race and social justice. Ms. Ginsberg produced and directed And Then They Came for Us, which has been in wide distribution for the past 4 years. Her most recent films are Truth to Power, Barbara Lee Speaks for Me, and Waging Change, which will be airing tonight at 8 p.m. on KQED TV in the Bay Area. Her other films can be found on her website at www.socialactionmedia.com. Satsuki Aina is a writer, activist, and psychotherapist. Dr. Aina was born in the Tule Lake internment camp. She is Professor Emeritus at Cal State, Sacramento. She is co-organizer of Suro for Solidarity, and she has produced 2 award-winning documentary films about the Japanese American incarceration experience, Children of the Camps and From a Silk Cocoon. Her upcoming book, Be Strong, Don't Cry, will soon be published by Heyday Press. George Takei is the author of the award-winning graphic novel memoir, They Called Us Enemy, his first-hand account of his years in Japanese American internment camps. Mr. Takei's acting career has spanned 5 decades, with more than 40 feature films and hundreds of television guest starring roles to his credit. He is best known for his portrayal of Mr. Sulu in Star Trek. Mr. Takei is also a social justice activist, social media megapower, New York Times bestselling author, originated the role of Sam Kimura and Oji Chan in the Broadway musical Allegiance, and the subject of To Be Takei, a documentary on his life and career. So we would usually clap now in our virtual space. All right, so if you have any questions that you'd like to ask the panelists, feel free to type in the Q&A box, and I'm also monitoring the chat box here, and then I will collect that when the time comes. So now I'm going to turn it over to the film director, Abby Ginsberg.
And Abby has a few thank yous that she wants to make before we start. So my first shout out is to Good Docs, who made the film available to everybody in all the libraries that we have had co-sponsored this with us. And we actually hope now that you know about Good Docs that you will think about looking at the other interesting films that they distribute at, and I'll put this in the chat in a minute, www.gooddocs.net. We could not have pulled this conversation together without Perlita Payne, who you just heard from, and the Berkeley Public Library offering to host the Zoom. I simply would have been overwhelmed if I had been hosting this Zoom. I also want to thank Fenwick and West, a Bay Area law firm who helped underwrite the expenses for this event, and to thank by name all the participating California libraries joining us: Anaheim, Berkeley, Chula Vista, Los Angeles, Marin, Oakland, Riverside, San Luis Obispo, Santa Barbara, Watsonville, Whittier, and I would also like to acknowledge the participation of the Sun Valley Community Library in Idaho. Lastly, I need to thank Jonathan Logan and the Jonathan Logan Family Foundation, who provided both the inspiration for the film as well as its funding. And we would not be here discussing this film if it had not been for their support and for George's participation and Satsuki's participation in the film. So thank you to everybody who helped us get to this day. And thank you for everybody joining us to have this day of remembrance together. So thank you. And with that, we're turning it over to Kristen Suzaki.
Thanks so much, Abby. It's such an honor to be here today on this annual day of remembrance with our panelists and, of course, with Mr. George Takei. And if you're like me, you're probably especially looking forward to hearing from George. And we're going to save the bulk of our time to allow for that. But I wanted to open up with a question from the filmmaker and director, or for the filmmaker and director, Abby Ginsberg. And Abby, you've been producing, directing, making films about social injustice and race for over 30 years. So I was wondering what drew you to this particular history of Japanese American incarceration? And I was also wondering if you could share your experience with the results of this particular film and the impact that it's having today.
Thank you for that question. So as I sort of mentioned in my thank yous, minding my own business and not sure what the ask was, Jonathan Logan came to me and said, there are these amazing photos by Dorothea Lange of people getting ready to go to camp and in the camps. And, I think there's a film that needs to go with this book that's being published of these photographs. And that provoked for me sort of a journey around, well, other films had been made, the question was kind of, what would my contribution to this be? And how could I feel good about working on this, given that I wasn't Japanese American, et cetera. And what was really unique about how we approached this, there were sort of two pieces. One was that the archival photographers who had found all this stuff in the National Archives had done an incredible job. Let me say their names. Their names are Rich Kahan and Michael Williams. And they had done an amazing job putting these photographs together and tracking down as many people as they could who were depicted in the photographs. So they already knew Satsuki because of the picture of her mother. And they already knew other people who, were children at the time that these photos were taken. So I came to the project having a lot of the legwork done for me, which was amazing. And then the question was, as I said, what was I going to bring to the project? And the answer to that is that just based on my generational age and everything else, I knew the lawyers. I had been a lawyer in another life and in an earlier life, let's say. And the lawyers, Dale Minami and Don Tamaki and others who had worked on reopening the Korematsu case were friends. And back when I did one of my earliest films, I made a condition of it that I wasn't going to work on this film, which had to do with USF Law School, unless they let me include the Korematsu story. And they were fine with that. So I've been attached to that story as part of my sort of filmmaking career for many, many years. And I felt like if I could figure out how to weave in the Coram Nobis case and bring it more up to the present and explain Fred Korematsu's relationship to all this, then my imprint and what I had to offer would sort of make sense. And it wouldn't just be a film about photographs. You know what I mean? It needed to be about more than that. And then, okay, so that all happens. And then the Muslim travel ban comes into effect. And the Japanese American community is, some of the largest protesters around that whole Muslim travel ban and around the notion that nobody had spoken up in opposition, or very few people had, in opposition to the Japanese American incarceration, and they weren't going to let this happen to another ethnic group. So when that all merged, then I kind of knew the direction for the film. And that is how I got here. And what I would say about the film is that it has traveled. I mean, this film started, fortunately, before the pandemic. It has traveled widely. It has been, I think, in part because of the Korematsu story being embedded in it, it's been very popular at bar association meetings and around, lawyers have somehow found important things in the film that they want to know about and talk about. And I, along with Satsuki, have done a lot of traveling with Don Tamaki. And, you know, I feel like the film has been extremely well received wherever we've gone. And this was, again, back in the day when you could rent a movie theater and fill it up with live bodies. So let me say, I am missing that experience right now. And then they came for us, remains my kind of last memory of what it was like to be in a large theater with a bunch of people. And I'm sorry to not, you know, to not have that experience right now with the other films that are out there. But it has been an honor to be part of this story, to feel like I was able to bring this story maybe to communities that didn't sort of fully know it, and to be part of sharing the Dorothea Lange photos, which in so many ways, you know, speak volumes. And then lastly, I have to do a shout out to my two main storytellers in the film. This film would not have worked without George and Satsuki in it, period, end of story. So I am so grateful that they each, you know, gave me the time and trusted me enough to let me include the way that they tell the stories in the film. So it has been a total honor to work on this project from day one.
Thank you so much for sharing, Abby. I want to kind of turn to Dr. Satsuki Ina to ask you about, you know, your work around the Muslim ban. I think some of the most powerful scenes in the documentary come from the rally that was held in San Francisco's Japantown to protest the Muslim travel ban, you know, which you helped organize. And I wanted to ask you, why is it or was it so important for Japanese Americans to speak out about issues like the Muslim travel ban?
Thank you, Christine, and thank you, Abby. It's an honor to be here today. Well, I think what was happening and continued to happen over the past 4 years has been so resonant with the experiences of the Japanese Americans during World War II. The targeting, racist targeting of a community of people. Back then, there was very little organizing and protest against our removal and incarceration. And so there were also immigration bans against the Chinese Americans and Asian Americans for many years. So all the actions, so I think that the importance of Abby's film was tying together what happened historically and what was happening in the moment. And that mobilized, particularly the Japanese American community, to use this opportunity to stand up for other communities. And in doing that, there's this very powerful healing and building of solidarity across Japanese American communities and Asian American communities, and finding a place and a voice to protest, using our story as kind of a bridge so people could have the broader perspective about how racism has been a part of US history from the very beginning.
Thank you. That's so powerful, and that's so inspiring. I had the good fortune of being there. I remember feeling what you mentioned, that kind of healing that was going on in the community. And speaking of inspiring, I wanted to turn it now to Mr. George Takei. George, it's such an honor to be able to speak with you today. You know, thank you for making time for being on this panel. And let me start with this question. In this film, you share your personal history, and it's so powerful. And as a member of the audience, I felt like I was there, you know, seeing the military police come and arrest your parents. And as a historian and as a yonsei, I want to say thank you for sharing this very personal history, and ask you, you know, why you think getting this history about forced removal and incarceration out to the public is so important, and what lessons do we have to learn from it today?
The primary thing is xenophobic hysteria has been a part of American history from the very beginning, and it's remained a constant. And when there are incidents of terrorizing incidents that deal with another ethnic group, then that xenophobic hysteria just surges up. And so Satsuki mentioned the 9/11 reaction. Currently, right now, as a result of the pandemic and the coronavirus having started in China, we have this past president who insisted on referring to it constantly as Chinese virus or the Wuhan virus or Kung flu. It happens throughout American history. When Pearl Harbor was bombed, that was a terrorizing incident. 2,000, over 2,400 people were killed. And that terror swept across the Pacific to the West Coast and rolled right through the United States. Hysteria. It was racist hysteria. And it went all the way up to the top man of this country, President Roosevelt. He was the president that said during the Depression, there is nothing to fear but fear itself. Even a man with that kind of wisdom got swept up in the racial hysteria of the time and signed Executive Order 9066. And hence what happened, the incarceration of American citizens who happened to be of Japanese ancestry were caught up in this shameful stain on American history. And uh, I grew up with it. I was a 5 year old child when the soldiers came. It was terrifying. And I remember that terror. But being a 5 year old child, I really didn't understand what that was all about. And my actual experience, my 4 years in three different camps, uh, are fun memories, exciting adventures. I mean, a child going to a totally different place, uh, living in a horse stall where the horses sleep, or going to the swamps of Arkansas, an exotic place where trees grew out of the water and their roots went undulated in and out of the water. I'm used to skinny stumps of tree that grow tall and there's a lush thatch on top. Palm trees. They were not exotic. They were just part of my landscape. So the swamps of Arkansas was absolutely fascinating. And I tried to capture that child and his reaction as truthfully as I can to in my graphic memoir, because I wanted to reach the young people of today. What happened in 1942 was so many generations past, and it's so important to remind Americans of this constant resurgence of xenophobia when something happens. And so I did it as a graphic memoir to reach the young readers of today, because it is as relevant today as it was terrifying for me when the soldiers came. But I wanted to capture the human aspect of a child. And also, the real story is what happened with my parents. And I saw what was happening with them. And I wanted to keep my child's reaction to that, but also bring my adult awareness of what was happening. So it's a double fold story in one family. Here we are on February 19th, Day of Remembrance. And each one of these have been powerfully significant for me. 4 years ago was the 75th anniversary of the Day of Remembrance. And I had an invitation to speak at the Franklin Delano Roosevelt Memorial Library on his vast estate in Hyde Park. His home was called Springwood, and I got to visit the home. It was a big mansion, visit this bedroom, and then Eleanor's bedroom next door to it. It was my adult experience. And it was one of the strangest journey I took from my apartment in New York up the Franklin Delano Roosevelt Parkway, passing through places with names like Yorktown, historic names, and then going there on that significant date. So February 19th is a very important day when I've had many unforgettable experiences. And the person that was the master of ceremonies or the host at that event at the Roosevelt Library was Kermit Roosevelt III, a member of the Roosevelt family. Uh, Actually, he was from the Theodore Roosevelt side of the family, but nevertheless, and he understands the internment story, the cruelty of it, and the untruth, the lies that were involved on the part of the government to incarcerate Japanese Americans. So it was a strange, but at the same time, enriching experience for me. February 19th, here we are in the year 2021, and it is powerfully resonant of the internment of Japanese Americans today.
Right. I wanted to ask you actually about your graphic novel that I believe came out in 2019. They called us enemies. So I'm so glad that you brought it up. You know, you have such a long history of activism, and that's so important. You know, in the film we see you testifying um, at the redress hearings. We see the work that you've done around the Muslim travel ban, and in many ways I see your graphic novel as part of this legacy of activism, something that you are putting out now for a younger generation, for the youth, right? Through this format. And I was wondering if you know, if there's a message that you want to get out to the youth today, what message is that through something like your latest work?
Well, I think it's important to be who you are. I'm an activist, yes, because of my personal and family and my people's history. But I'm also a writer and an actor. And we have to use all that we are, that we have, as a tool to accomplish an issue that you feel strongly about. So, as preposterous as it may have sounded, we developed a Broadway musical on the internment story. I mean, uh, I told Senator Danny Noe about our plans when we were developing Allegiance, and he said, "A musical on the internment?" He was just incredulous. I said, "You'll have to see it." Unfortunately, he passed
Mm.
before we opened on Broadway. But every tool that we have, if you're a writer, or if you're an insurance salesman, or if you're a school teacher, particularly school teacher, or in the case of what we're doing this afternoon, a librarian, be that librarian. And if you are concerned about our country, the noble ideals that it stands for, you do something about it with who you are and what you do. Take your passion as a tool to reach more people, to make, in order to, what our mission is to make America true to its ideals. We are Americans, and our democracy is dependent on, it's a people's democracy, and it's we who make our democracy as true as its shining ideals.
Can I just say something? That's why I made the film. I'm also an activist.
You're a
That
filmmaker.
nailed it for me. I'm a filmmaker. This needed to be called out, and Satsuki then later went to some of the places where they were putting families and doing family separation in Texas that were repurposed from the old days of being incarceration camps. So it's like, we have to, it's the whole thing about, we have to know our history to stop repeating it. And as activists, we have to find those places and moments and shout it as loud as we can and educate as many people as we can. I mean, let me just say one other thing. There's a thing in the chat where somebody says, I can't believe people are not being taught this in high school. Well, I grew up in New York, and I am here to tell you, nobody mentioned this when I was in high school. I mean,
It's happening now. It's
it is
happening
happening
now.
now more. And in California, it's a little bit better. But there are plenty of places where this film is shown, and people, and I say to people, how many of you heard about this in high school? And nobody in the audience raises their hand. So we still have work to do to make sure that our young people are educated. And so great that George's book is a graphic novel. I mean, how great is that? And let me just say, as part of this event, we have given a copy of the graphic novel to every single library, and some of them had it already, so now they have 2 copies.
Thank you.
You're welcome, and I'm so glad to have done it. So the book, his book has been sent. I actually sent it myself to all the libraries earlier this week.
Bless your heart. You have a big one too.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, you know, every year I teach survey courses in Asian American history, and usually at UCSD, and I always start off by asking students when we get to our unit on Japanese American incarceration, how many of you have learned about this in high school? And you see numbers increasing, students saying now, I had a little bit, just a little bit, maybe like a couple of paragraphs. But I think thanks to the work that you are all doing, that this history is being brought to light and is something that youth are more familiar with today. And thanks to your graphic novel, George, I use it in class. It's such a great teaching tool. Yeah, for students. But I wanted to bring 3 of you in conversation with each other right now, and just maybe start off by asking Abby, how did you get Satsuki and George involved in your project? Like, how did that all come together?
George was harder than Satsuki. Satsuki met me. You asked Satsuki how she decided to agree to deal with me. Satsuki can answer that. George has a very good gatekeeper in his manager/husband. And Brad initially said no. He's too busy. He's too this. And then I think what happened was I wrote back and I said, I knew I needed George. Let me say, I was the beggar here. I knew I needed him because I knew his storytelling ability. And I did a combination of begging and telling him that this was a movie that George would want to be in. And somehow that worked. And I think in the end, I mean, let's say the movie's been seen by, many thousands of people who may not have been able to see George in Allegiance, or may only know him, from Star Trek. So it's like, he did want to be in this movie, even if he didn't necessarily know it at the time. And he elevated the movie. I mean, really, his presence graces the film and elevated it because of his very unique storytelling ability. And I get to say this to him right now on Zoom. I just want to say, George, what is amazing about how you tell the stories about from your youth is you tell them, even though you say I was 5 at the time, it provides the audience with a kind of we were there moment. So we feel the military police coming up your doorstep and your mother standing out there crying. I mean, everything that you describe, I felt in a way that I wouldn't have been able to describe that myself from my own life. So I just want to say, I was right. I did need you. And I'm really glad somehow we got you in the film, because it is much stronger and much better for having you. So,
well, I shared part of my incarceration with Satsuki. She was born in Tule Lake. I was, by that time, I think I was 6 or 7. So I have a better memory of Tule Lake, I think, than rather than Satsuki does. But it's a common shared experience at different times and at different points in our lives. Satsuki, why don't you speak up?
So part of my initial reluctance of working with Abby is because I had never met her, and there's always this concern about a non-Japanese person telling the Japanese American story. And so we met in person, and I listened to her and knew that she had done a lot of background work and everything. But what cinched it for me is we were planning this a rally in San Francisco, Japantown, to protest the Muslim ban. And it was right after the election had happened, and people were in great distress. And I called her at the last minute and I said, we're doing a protest. Bring your camera crew and show up if you really want to know how our community is responding to what's happening in this country today. And there was a part of me that didn't expect that she would show up. But sure enough, she did. She captured it. She helped to get the story out. And she has been that person all the way through the making of the film. We've traveled together. We went to Japan together. We shared the film, the story of the film together. And so Abby is a true ally to communities of color. And she has been a voice that has bridged many communities. And I'm forever grateful for having met you, Abby, and feel like you have been a shiro for our community. So thank you.
And thank you for that. Thank you.
Well, you know, I believe, as I said at the beginning, this is an American story, and Japanese Americans should not be possessive of it as ours and not trust non-Japanese Americans to tell that story. We have to think bigger than that. This is an American story, and it was the fundamental American values: equal justice under the law, due process, uh, government uh, 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 ruled by law. I mean, these are the ideals that were violated by the people in a people's democracy. And so this is our experience, but what the real core issue is the drama of how shining ideals, glorious ideals, can be violated by a government that's made up of the people that came up with those ideals. So it's an American story at its core. And we need to, as Americans, work in concert with everybody because it's related to the African American story. African Americans, in many ways, have a greater reason for redress and restitution than Japanese Americans do. And we have HR 40 that's going before Congress that we need to be actively involved in. The Muslim travel ban, as Satsuki said, we're all, responsive to that because the core issue was making that sweeping statement that all Muslims are potential terrorists. When we were incarcerated, that sweeping generalization was that we were all potential spies, saboteurs, or fifth columnists. This is an American story. And because it's a people's democracy, we are as fallible as human beings.
I want to add maybe two other thoughts about this. I so agree with what George just said. Every February, I spend most of February being aggravated that that's the only time we're going to program Black stories, is Black History Month. I mean, no, Black history is American history, and we need to know it, and we need to know it every month of the year. So I really agree. This is, both for African American history and Japanese American history. Here we go. This is an American story. And I want to say something about Dorothea Lange. Here was a white American woman who was disabled by polio, and actually had a serious disability that she somehow managed to overcome to take all her amazing photos, and would sit on the top of cars and hang from various places to get her shots. And I mean, again, the original impetus for this film was to have more people see what she saw. And what you get by looking at the photos that are in the film. And the thing about the film was that it was sort of the first time that we could see those pictures larger than a postage stamp. And we blew them up and we made sure people could see them and appreciate them. And what you get is her empathy and her understanding that she is photographing people during one of the worst time, probably the worst time that they had ever experienced, at the moment where they're waiting for the buses and they're at the horse stalls and so on. And that's what she's documenting. And I just feel like, you know, she preserved that history so other people can say what they have to say about it. You know, but you want to appreciate the fact that it was largely Dorothea Lange's work, her eye and her empathy, I mean, her talent, her eye, and her empathy that gave us a body of work from which all the rest of us can now pontificate. But you know, yes, this is, we're all participating and trying to craft an understanding of how, as George says, the American ideals got shredded during World War II.
You know, there is a Japanese American photographer who is just as heroic and was as important, perhaps important in a different way. A man named Toyo Miyatake, who is a photographer in Los Angeles. We were all forbidden to take anything dealing with a camera or any mechanical things, anything with sharp edges or points, you know, and yet defying that order, he smuggled in lenses wrapped in his underwear and brought it into camp and constructed his own camera to record it. Dorothea Lange was an outsider looking in at us. What Toyo Miyatake did was capture the Japanese incarcerated looking at ourselves. And she was forbidden to photograph the barbed wire fence or the sentry towers. Toyo Miyatake captured that. So he was a vitally important pillar as a photographer to
Totally.
contribute to the record of the internment of Japanese Americans.
I could not, I mean, he's in the film for that reason, you know.
Right.
I mean, we do a serious
I
commentary.
just wanted to get balance up your praise of
Absolutely.
Dorothea Lange with
I was
Toyo
doing the
Miyatake.
defense of white women thing. You
Not that I'm just, you know, saying advocating for Japanese Americans only.
I think we're going to turn to some Q&A questions now, if you folks don't mind. We got lots in them that we've received, over 40. So I tried to sort through it. Can you see it, Kristen, the ones that I've chosen to start off with?
No, I can't. I do have one to start off with if you want
Okay.
me to, and you want, or you can go first. It doesn't.
Okay, go ahead and ask your question, and then I can share
Okay.
the ones that I found here.
Sure. So this question is coming in from Hana Yoshimoto, and she writes to George and Satsuki, how have your experiences with internment influenced how you feel about what is happening right now in our country in regards to the rise in hate crimes against Asian Americans? Hana also says, thank you both for your vulnerability and your work. I am incredibly grateful.
Go ahead, Satsuki.
So I think I've been tremendously impacted. One of the things that is coming up for me as I'm listening to is the degree of race hatred that has been publicized and made known to the country today has led to this really extraordinary experience of coalition building, of people working across community for change rather than just working within their own community. And in that, there is a really profound healing for communities who have been oppressed, who've had to stand alone. And the healing is in reaction to the fracturing that racism causes, so that when we work with other communities to support their efforts, and we get support from other communities as well, there is an empowerment that happens that is really meaningful for me personally, but also as a psychotherapist, thinking about ways in which racism isolates people and encourages more fracturing, and the current anti-Asian violence, some of the calls for we need more police, or this is pure racism. What we're learning is that these acts of violence uh, are a result of decades of unconscious and often deliberate ways of characterizing people of color, and justifying and finding ways, and particularly when someone as powerful as the President of the United States can stigmatize a group of people, can bring out this racial hatred. And the only way we fight this racial hatred is through programs like this, getting librarians and teachers to educate the children. Really, we need to change the very deep narrative, not just the surface narrative that we're all created equal, but the deep narrative that this is a country, as George says, with very noble principles. And it feels like one of the passions for me is about rewriting this narrative in a way that supports working together, overriding the fractionalizing that has resulted. And the opportunity before us right now is Black reparations. And we are seeing in the Japanese American community very strong efforts, as George said, about supporting HR 40, that the commission that really organized and made it possible for, from a grassroots level, for people to speak about their experience, that changed the hearts of many congressional leaders about how to vote for the Civil Liberties Act. So I think there's something growing that can really change the tide and promote this ideal that we care about each other, we will act for each other, we will take care of each other. And I think children growing up and hearing those kinds of stories is going to be really important.
Well, I think of, I feel like I was blessed in having been cast in Star Trek, because Star Trek had a wonderful philosophy. And this is back in the 60s when the country was so divided. The Vietnam War, the civil rights movement going on, whole youth cultural ferment, the hippies. At a time like that, Star Trek came on, where the driving ideal of the Starship Enterprise was this acronym IDIC, IDIC, infinite diversity in infinite combinations. It was our diversity coming together and working in concert as a team that made the Starship Enterprise boldly go where no one had gone before. Uh, and that really is an important idea for us to keep in mind as a vision of the American future. We are very divided right now. We had a very divisive president. We're now getting back on track, but our strength is in our diversity, working together, each part contributing their unique contribution, their unique vantage point on an issue, because we Japanese Americans with the internment issue have benefited from the pioneering that African Americans did on the civil rights issue. And the Muslim movement today is benefiting from the pioneering of the African Americans and the Asian Americans and all the other group. And certainly with the issue of immigration, the Latino issue is one that is going to be strengthened by the Asian American vantage point on that same issue. It's an American issue. We're on the Starship United States, and infinite diversity in infinite combinations working together will help us live long and prosper. It's a little corny, but we need a little lightness.
Okay, Kristen, I made you co-host. Can you see the Q&A box? You
Yeah,
don't know?
I definitely, I can see them.
Oh, you can. Okay,
Definitely.
so I
Mhm.
chose. It says answer live for the ones that if you want to
Okay,
go through there. Okay.
sure. So we have another question up from Ian Martin, and Ian writes, "Thank you for a very thoughtful documentary. I am a Yonsei Hapa whose mother was born in Rower. In
Mm.
what ways would the Nisei and Sansei, and the Issei if they were still with us, like for Yonsei, Gosei, and even younger generations to carry on this work? How can we who did not experience this do justice to continue its memory in various art forms in a respectful manner, as well as preventing this from happening in the future, such as with the proposed Muslim travel ban?"
Well, I'll speak to that just briefly. I think that, one of the things that has happened is we have preserved many of the stories. Densho is an organization in Seattle that has collected oral histories, to be seen in perpetuity. I think that for the younger generation, identifying with the story of their ancestors and speaking out is going to be really important. Using a voice. I think that the younger generations have a stronger sense of entitlement. And my hope is that they will use that to be outspoken, to take action on behalf of other Asian American organizations and groups, but other groups as well. There's a definite value in having days of remembrance and calling together our memories as a way to inspire us to keep fighting for social justice.
This is for the young people, Yonsei, Gosei, and most of the women in my family now have surnames like O'Malley or Lockheim or Weiss. We are becoming assimilated, and this is their stories, especially. Young Japanese Americans are not without a heritage. They have an important, vital heritage. Just like African Americans today are not slaves. They don't have to have experienced slavery to be able to know what brought that about, the mentality, the white superiority. And so it is their legacy. And for them to feel that they don't have any way to connect with that is absolutely untrue. And that's why classes like yours or librarians that we're reaching this afternoon are playing a vitally important role in giving young people of Japanese heritage a sense of who they are, their identity, and that they have a very important role to play in defining the America that we all envision our future America to be.
I just want to say one thing too, is that on March 6th, Tsudu for Solidarity is sponsoring a panel of kid activists, ranging from age 12 to 17, who are sharing their artwork and their projects that have risen out of this need to express their reaction to the racism and the injustices that are happening across the country. And they have decided that they're going to do what they can to support Ivan and Hilda Ramirez, who are being held in sanctuary for the past 5 years. And it's been very moving to see very young children articulate their anger and their outrage about how families are being separated at the border and the injustice that they witness on the news every day. So they're out there. They're doing their thing, and hopefully people will get to hear what they have to say.
Saskia, do you know where it's going to be available? I'm trying to type something in the chat. I know how to spell Suru for solidarity.
Yeah, if they go to the Sudo for Solidarity website, there we have we've posted the information there.
Okay, great.
Youth Speak Out.
Okay, so it's in the chat now.
Okay, thank you.
Would you mind just saying a few words about what Sudo for Solidarity is
Sure.
for our audience?
So Sudo for Solidarity is a grassroots organization led mostly by people who were incarcerated as children. So we started as a group of elders protesting the incarceration focused in Texas, because there were many of us who were separated from our fathers at Crystal City, Texas, which was an internment camp during World War II, 40 miles west of where 2,400 mothers and children from Central America were being held. So we went to Crystal City to have a pilgrimage, and then decided that we would bring our families and protest outside of the Dilley, South Texas Family Residential Center. And from that was a continued effort intergenerationally to bring light to what was happening today and how it was relevant and parallel to what happened to us as children during World War II. So we had planned to bring 125,000 paper cranes, which is origami tsuru, to hang on the White House fence in protest of the policies at that time that were separating children from their parents. And because of COVID, of course, we had to pivot, and we're doing these community education workshops until it's safe for us elders and children to show up with our paper cranes. So thank you, Abby. If people go to that website, you can see information about this amazing panel that will include the 14-year-old boy who is currently in sanctuary using his art to tell his story.
Let me just ask, because, okay, we were sending, all these notes to thinking it was reaching everybody. It was just going back to the panelists. I have now figured out to the panelists and attendees. So if anything else, anybody needs to know something else, write it into the chat and I'll answer it for everybody.
Okay, great.
Okay, next.
Okay, I think that's it for our Q&A questions. I'm so sorry, our time has run out. And I'm so sorry, Dr. Ina, I mispronounced your name. So I just wanted to send my apologies there. And I'm sorry for the YouTube viewers. We were having some technical difficulty in the beginning. So, but that's been fixed. But most of you were able to make it into the Zoom room. So I'm gonna, go ahead, Abby.
I just want to say that this has been recorded and we will make it available. So somebody just asked that in the chat. Yes, the webinar has been recorded. And I'm assuming it'll go up on Berkeley Public Library's site at some point, and we'll send that out.
We will share it out.
Okay.
As soon as possible.
Okay.
So I'm gonna turn the closing over to Abby and Kristen.
Abby, do you want to go ahead?
I want to say a big thank you to everybody who showed up as our audience, and to George and to Satsuki for being here with us, to Perlita again for making this happen. And to all the libraries who sort of came. I mean, I had this idea that maybe we should celebrate, Day of Remembrance with this kind of an event, and who knew if anybody was going to say they were interested. So I am incredibly grateful. Again, I think, part of the message here is support your public library. It's an amazing resource, and what an honor it is for us, to be able to have people from all across the state on the same Zoom experience. I mean, I'm going to come up with some other ideas for you guys. So, because I love working through my public library, and am just incredibly grateful for the reach that it has to people in a community that we would never otherwise get to interact with. So thank you all for being here and for sort of sharing this Day of Remembrance with us. Especially George. Thank you, George. Sharing your insights, sharing, your humanity with us. So that's my swan song. That's my goodbye.
Yeah, I just want to echo thank you to everyone, the organizers, the public library systems. It's been such an honor today. I wanted to just see if George, did you want to leave us with any parting words or before we have to wrap up and get going?
Live long and prosper.
So
Well,
I'll turn it
Okay.
back over to Perlita.
Okay, well, thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. And thank you, panelists, George, Sutsky, Kristen, and Abby. Really quite an honor to have spent this time with you all. And maybe we can do another something. All of us. All
I'm
right.
all for something.
Okay, we have your word, George.
For something.
I have it
said
recorded.
something.
Oh, something. Okay. All right. So I'm going to stop the recording now. And we'll be done. Thank you.
everybody have a nice night. And if you're in the Bay Area, watch my film Waging Change at 8 p.m. tonight on KQED if you haven't had enough of me already. It's about the tip minimum wage. And here's talk about another issue we have to get behind,
Mhm.
which is raising the minimum wage for restaurant workers all across this country.
Absolutely.
It's past time. So, yeah. Okay, everybody, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, everybody. Thank
Yeah,
you.
thank you. Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Have a good night.
Bye.
Bye.